Radio Retro Future.
Hey, good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bunsard of Radio Retro Future, and welcome back to another episode of Steampunkish, where we examine old steampunk-related media. And today we're gonna have a look at Rise of Nations, Rise of Legends. On the surface, Rise of Nations looked like a typical Age of Empires knockoff, which were very popular at the time. Age of Empires and Rise of Nations belong to a series of RTSs where players could develop their civilizations throughout several periods of human history. In the original Age of Empires, you started in the Stone Age and developed all the way to the early Roman Empire. Rise of Nations was a little bit different, that you started in the Stone Age and developed all the way to modern day. However, the comparison stopped there, as Rise of Nations had a whole new take on real-time strategy. And in a time of countless Age of Empires and Warcraft knockoffs, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Rise of Nations abandoned the traditional RTS gameplay that had been so prevalent in the 2000s. For example, most RTS maps were simply divided into equal parts, with player starting positions neatly tucked away in the corners or the edge of the map, some locations for secondary bases, and maybe some valuable resources in the center of the map where the players could fight over to gain an edge over the other. In Rise of Nations, players did start in similar positions, however it introduced the idea of national borders. National borders would be generated by cities or fortified buildings, and the player could only build within its own national border. So in practice, the map would be divided into zones controlled by the players. In turn, the zones within these national borders could then be conquered by other players by damaging and capturing key structures. Controlling a zone didn't just mean you could build inside of them, it also meant that your troops would be given certain benefits, like health regeneration to your units and attrition damage to hostiles. This also changed the entire nature of multiplayer. Having an alliance with another player on the map didn't just mean you would attack the same enemies. It also means you can freely move through their controlled territories without suffering any damage along the way. Also, the economy of the game was unique at the time. Most RTSs of the time only had one or two resources that the players had to gather in order to construct buildings or build units. And if you ran out, you'd simply hear something like,
"You require more Vespine gas."
However, Rise of Nations threw that out of the window. Economic growth was limited by a resource cap and could only be expanded by building districts attached to the cities that you control. And the same goes for the unit cap of your armies. So players were always fighting over the cities to be able to expand their economy and their army. So let's say you have enough mines to generate like 500 gold a minute, but if your gold generation cap had been limited to 200, the other 300 gold you harvested that minute would go to waste and you would still only gain 200. Although there were some RTS games at the time that had copied similar mechanics from Rise of Nations, I have seldom seen such complex economic models ever since. Also, it introduced squad-based units instead of the singular infantry units we were used to back in the day. Although it didn't matter much in terms of gameplay, it was awesome to see. And it actually now felt like you were commanding an army, instead of a group of single units that would just get in the way of one another. It also made use of the rock, paper, scissors system like Age of Empires and Empire Earth back in the day. Pikemen, for example, would do extra damage to cavalry units would do additional damage to ranged units, and so on. A last thing I want to mention is, it streamlined traditional RTS gameplay by allowing land units to traverse water on their own, which saved a lot of micromanaging on the player's part. Instead of building transportation ships, like in Age of Empires, you could just build a dock, and that allowed all your land units from this point on to cross rivers and seas. Of course, they were extremely vulnerable to ships. Case in point, Rise of Nations was very innovative at the time. However, it also used existing RTS tropes, so it didn't alienate players. This level of complexity simply was not for everyone, and now it lingers in a kind of limbo, being played only by the most dedicated of fans. But if you're interested in Rise of Nations, the entire collection is still for sale on Steam. What is not for sale on Steam, however, is Rise of Nations, Rise of Legends. which is really too bad because it's a superior title in more than one way. 3 years after Rise of Nations, Big Huge Studios, in collaboration with Microsoft, returned with a spiritual successor. Although Rise of Legends continues many of the gameplay aspects of Rise of Nations, it created a whole new original setting, which I want to talk about today. First, I was skeptical if I could make this decade-old game work on my current system, but I managed to do it by running it in compatibility mode. And when I started playing the campaign, I was simply blown away. The game has aged wonderfully. Yes, the unit models have aged, but have done so like a fine wine. Because of the low frame rate in which the units move, it's almost like these clockwork monstrosities move in stop motion. I mean, how cool is that? Also, the interface is quite up to par with today's standards. I only wish I could zoom out further than I can, especially because of these cities take such a large place on the screen. But damn, I mean, look at these cities! It stops me from complaining not being able to zoom out, because I would miss out on all this detail. And some of the mission maps, I mean, damn, this world looks elaborate. I can't recall a single game that has engrossed me so much in the maps themselves as this game has. Now, there are some changes from the original Rise of Nations. For example, you cannot build cities anymore. Instead, you've got neutral cities scattered across the maps that you need to either convert or conquer. Also, there's no water, so instead you now have air transports that work, well, like those in traditional RTSs. Which kind of feels like a step back, but under the circumstances I can't blame them. Although there are some separate buildings that you can build, usually buildings for unit production, the cities themselves have been simplified. Instead of constructing separate buildings like markets and temples, the city itself has been reduced to a single structure that can be upgraded with districts that attach themselves to the main hub. So the race you see here are called Da Vinci. Get it? Da Vinci, as in Da Vinci? Yeah, real clever. But what about the other races? Well, here's the thing. You see, I don't want to spoil too much about the other races, because playing the campaign without taking a look at all the races that are playable, I kind of felt, well, playing the campaign for the first time all those years ago, I was going on an adventure, waiting for the final enemy to be revealed in the final campaign. Now I realize that this game is, as far as I'm aware, not available by legal means, unless it's officially abandonware, but I am not sure. All I know is that the rights to Rise of Legends have changed hands a number of times, but Big Huge Studios and Microsoft still seem to be involved in it somehow. A matter of fact, on the website of Microsoft there's an ongoing petition to get Rise of Legends re-released on Steam. Links down below if you want to participate. That being said, but I think the best way to experience the campaign of Rise of Legends is not knowing what to expect, and therefore not look into the other factions of the game. So I decided that I will make a second video on Rise of Legends in the future, so I can also delve more into the world and how the factions are made up and why some succeeded and others did not. Despite our thematic difference, all races play pretty much the same. It are mostly the units themselves and how they conduct research that differ. Gameplay wise, the game has pretty much taken over many of the elements of Rise of Nations, for which I am not complaining. Because unlike Rise of Nations, they don't have to upgrade from different ages, they could spend a lot more energy on the development of single units. And it shows. Especially the Vinci units are just wonderful to look at, and the cities are all wonderfully animated. Unlike Rise of Nations, however, you cannot found new cities. All of these have to be conquered either from enemies or neutral factions that are scattered across the map. These neutral cities can either be conquered by brute force, or they can be purchased with a resource simply called wealth. Wealth is generated by building caravans, usually air units which will travel between cities. However, research for Da Vinci works differently than for the other races. Instead of research, the industrial district for Da Vinci will give you a point you can spend in your prototype lab. The prototype lab is unique in this game because it allows you to choose between special units or upgrades. Units chosen in this way are unique and cannot be purchased any other way in the game. Every time you spend a point, you get to choose between 3 different units and or upgrades. When the point is spent, you get 3 new choices instead. For their more general research upgrades, Da Vinci have to build research labs. The fun thing about these buildings is that they can be upgraded into completely new structures, which will give them research points but also completely unique functions. Some of these are very powerful defensive structures, while others can boost your economy. But the observatory, for example, can be pointed in any direction to give you line of sight all across the map. And although it's a very fun feature of the game, I also thought it was a bit distracting. I love Da Vinci as a retro-futuristic race. It has musketeers, it has robots, it has dragoons and other forms of cavalry, and of course mighty airships. They also have a unique unit of which they can only build 1 at a time. A huge spider-like digging machine called the Land Leviathan. I think I've seen it somewhere else before, but not sure where. If I have to point at one major improvement over Rise of Nations, it's the combat itself. In Rise of Nations, combat was slow-paced, but it was kind of chaotic, units were small, and the unit AI went all over the place. I constantly had to regroup my men, because once they set their sights on a target, they would chase it all across the map. Rise of Legends streamlined the gaming AI, which makes your army a lot more manageable. Also, the squads are larger, and combat is even more slow-paced. Maybe this was intentional, because now you have characters that have unique abilities. Rise of Nations already had similar characters, but I rarely used their ability because I thought it was quite useless. I suspect this is because Rise of Nations was catering to multiplayer. Its single player campaigns, for example, were lazy, just skirmish over and over again. Now Rise of Legends is kinda like that, however there's much more focus on story. It also has introduced unique characters who all have special abilities. Giacomo Giamba, for example. A Vinci inventor that has several special abilities, like a healing ability, a sonic blast that will stun and damage units, and he can send out a clockwork demolition team. Each race has its own collection of special characters that all have their own unique abilities, like summoning units. And because combat is slower paced, it's easier for a less experienced player to use these during combat, without having the ability to make 60 mouse clicks a minute, like in competitive StarCraft for example. But that doesn't mean this RTS is easy. Actually, it's very clear they intended this to be a competitive multiplayer experience. When playing single player skirmish for example, I remember the computer AI battering my defenses down because I was not quick enough at the beginning. I couldn't bring up the resources to keep countering attacks and, well, each successful defense just meant I was postponing the inevitable. A matter of fact, I dare to say that one of the first skills you need to learn is how to start up your game. Because if you're too slow and you allow your enemy to capture too many of these neutral cities, your chance of winning is extremely slim, as you will just be overwhelmed both by his superior numbers and superior resources. Especially because the game gives you a lot of free units just by constructing buildings, for example. Also, purchasing neutral cities with wealth gives you control over the units guarding that neutral city, instantly. Rise of Legends also adapted the national border system from Rise of Nations, so that's also something you have to take into account. Rise of Legends isn't just a game about building an army. You have to take into account how the map has been shaped, how the map has been divided among the cities. And because combat is quite slow paced and units are quite durable, once the first engagement has begun, it can take minutes before it is over, and it will become a long dragged out battle between players, and logistics starts to play an important role. Generating enough resources and making sure your production buildings are close enough to the front line means the difference between victory and defeat. Each race also has a special ability. The Vinci special ability, for example, is Industrial Devastation, which makes the ground collapse beneath the enemy's feet, dealing damage and stunning them. It can be used anytime, however it also needs to recharge before it can be used again. Now these abilities are not as powerful as, let's say, the nuclear missiles in Red Alert, However, they can turn the tide of a single engagement, which also can mean the end between victory and defeat on the long run, and are therefore more useful than powerful. And that's just the way I like it. You also don't need special buildings for this, just a simple upgrade at the beginning. So every player will have access to these abilities very early on in the game. I find it hard to criticize Rise of Legends in a negative way. The world building is awesome, although the story itself is rather shallow. But I will get into that in another video, if I feel like it. But I think this game was intended to be a competitive multiplayer game, just like StarCraft was. But this game is not StarCraft. StarCraft worked because all three races played so very differently, but they chose to stay true to the concept of Rise of Nations, so all the races had to be very similar at its core, making the differences between the races only marginal. Also, StarCraft had likable characters with their own story arcs. Rise of Legends could have been a competitor if they would have approached it the way Blizzard approached StarCraft, creating a massive space opera with three completely unique races that all play differently. Many studios tried, most have failed. This includes EA games with the Command & Conquer franchise, by creating the What Were They Thinking Command & Conquer 4, turning StarCraft into the great victor of the RTS war. Which is a great shame, because Rise of Legends has a lot of potential. But as I will demonstrate in my next video on this game, they clearly lost interest in developing the world and its characters. And they turned the plot into a very typical tale of revenge and oh no, now we must save the world from this great evil plot. They kind of failed in that too, to be quite honest with you. But visually and gameplay wise, Rise of Legends is just a great game, and it's sad that it has become forgotten. Sadder yet that you can't find it anywhere other than eBay. But this is why I started Steampunkish, so these titles can be remembered for what they were. So if you're watching this and you like what I do, please let me know if there are any other franchises, games, anime, movies, board games, or other forms of media that are related to steampunk or may have inspired you to start with steampunk to begin with. Send me a comment or contact us through Facebook on Radio Retro Future, and maybe I'll make a video on it. And with that, I bid you adieu. Thank you for watching, and of course a thank you to all my generous Patreon patrons for their monthly contributions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, make it your way.